Hello, squishies, and welcome back to Replay, the show where games are art. We're back with more To the Moon, and as Act 2 begins, Rosaline and Watts are stymied. We reach Johnny's childhood but are stuck, unable to proceed, because that memory is broken and disrupted. With nothing else to do, our heroes return to the Johnny avatar from the beginning of their journey. This version of Johnny has an interesting question for them. Why can't they just give him the memory of going to the moon and call it a day? And the answer is equally interesting, that what they're working with here is just data. But if they don't ship it to fit with Johnny's identity, don't make it a coherent narrative rooted in his motivations, when they try to upload it into the real Johnny, it'll be rejected. This is a great metaphor for narrative-heavy games. The essence of a game is that it is, within the framework of the rules, under the player's control. That means that at any points where the narrative is imposed on the player forcefully and externally, where the events of the game diverge from the player's own narrative that they've assigned their character, become less effective. While any form of art has some degree of interactivity because all art presents signifiers that the perceiver must assign signifieds, games are defined by it. To become less interactive is to become less game-like. So a narrative-heavy game like To the Moon must find ways to preserve the player's sense of control, which is to say it must minimize perceived lack of control, a point which will become problematic for some of the games we'll be discussing in future replay seasons. There are a lot of ways to do this. One is to give the player control of the story itself, branching plot lines, alternate endings, that kind of thing. Another is to have a fixed narrative, but give the player control of how it's presented. For example, in Metroid Prime, most of the narrative happens in text files the player must find and read using the scan visor, meaning the player's decisions, not to mention how good they are at finding the files, determine the order and pacing of their experience of the story. The Urquan Masters does both. There is one fixed ending, but only about half of the events of the game are actually necessary to reach it, and many of those can be done in any order. Plus, there's an expansive backstory which the player learns piecemeal from conversations throughout the game. And since the game uses dialogue trees, the player has great control over those conversations. To the Moon takes a different approach, and it's the one Rosaline and Watts just described. The game presents the player with character motivations and emotions so that we accept the fixed narrative we're given. Because it's well constructed and emotionally evocative, we accept it. Because we therefore don't feel like the characters of the story are going in a direction that opposes our own intentions, we don't feel like it's being yanked away from us. We feel in control even though we know we're not. That metaphor aside, the idea that a memory has to fit our understanding of ourselves or be rejected jibes very well with the idea of identity as narrative, which is not one of the major themes of this game, but does seem to be more or less assumed. In this case, I'm using narrative not in the colloquial sense of a synonym to story, but in the technical sense of the framework within which a story occurs. The structural elements, the ordering of events, the way they're framed and presented, while the story is the events themselves. In this sense, identity is a narrative. Our identities are ways of making sense of, framing, and presenting the events of our lives. Certainly that's what the experience of realizing I'm a woman was like. The events of my life shifted into new alignments, settled into a new structure that made sense of them in ways they never had before. An explosion of new understanding. That's what womanhood is. A structure within which memories, thoughts, feelings, and experiences can be placed to make sense of them. Same with all my other identities, my ethnicity, my politics, my religious beliefs, my ethos, my sexuality, my labor, my class. Each of these narratives combine to form a single complex structure, a narrative within which the chaotic events of my life become a coherent tale which makes sense to me, and which even allows me to figure out what new experience and ideas can fit into my narrative, which is to say which ones to pursue. I don't believe in essential natures or souls or anything like that, and I don't think this game requires them as part of its premise. It's not that memories that go against Johnny's nature can't be uploaded into him. It's that if they don't fit his narrative, his understanding of who he is, they won't make sense. And as we often do with thoughts or feelings that don't make sense or don't cohere with who we understand ourselves to be, he'll push the memory aside. So we have to make it fit his narrative. We have to find the reason he wants to go to the moon, the shape of the hole in his narrative which going to the moon would fill, and then find a way to make going to the moon the right shape to fit in that hole. But Watts and Rosaline try to force it anyway. What more can they do? It's not exactly like trying to force a square peg into a round hole, after all. It's more like trying to force a square peg into a hole of unknown shape that you can't see. Which brings us to this line up the memory links puzzle. It annoys me a little, actually, because the way it's set up, it's impossible to create one continuous flow from present to past. Instead, you link up each era one by one, but linking the next always breaks the flow. This annoys me because it goes directly against the idea that we're creating a go to the moon thread running throughout his life. There never is a continuous thread, just this repeatedly broken one. Although, now that I think about it, this is the only time this puzzle shows up. When we're forcing it, knowing that we're not creating that thread but trying to push through anyway, we get the puzzle where the thread cannot be created. Later, when we actually do successfully alter Johnny's memories, we won't see this. So, there's really two ways to read this. One is that our lives really don't have a narrative flow, we just try to force one. Which is kind of true. Real life is much more complex and messy than any story. In fiction, events happen to set up later events, building toward a climax. The guns are on the mantelpiece in Act 2 because they're going to be used in Act 4. The future causes the past. That's the opposite of how reality works. Events happen as a consequence of earlier events building from an origin. The guns are on the mantelpiece today because someone put them there yesterday. In short, the past causes the future. But our very identities are narrative. We cannot help but try to build patterns and tell stories. We push our memories into our narratives and reject whatever doesn't fit. In short, we force the appearance of a thread running through our lives when really there never was one. The other reading is that this puzzle represents Watts and Rosaline's attempt to force the memory. And the fact that it's impossible to create a thread foreshadows that they will fail to implant the memory, which of course they do. The two readings aren't exclusive or contradictory. We can easily read it as both. Of course, there's also another reading of the fact that Johnny's memory is unchanged. Simply put, we oftentimes resist things we want because they don't fit our narratives of ourselves. I cannot begin to tell you how many things I never did, tried to convince myself I didn't like or want because they didn't fit with my narrative of the time. Things I can embrace now because I have a new narrative, which is why I've experienced that change as immensely freeing. Some are straightforward results of the weird, semi-random way we internalize cultural constructs. Most of us would find, I think, deep down, bizarre notions of whether certain actions are coded masculine or feminine, ones which make no sense to us but are nonetheless there, because at some point in our childhoods we drew conclusions from observation of the world around us. For example, I used to avoid using emojis. I didn't have anything against them, they just felt not me. Now I use them constantly. Apparently, somewhere along the way, I picked up the idea that quick, simple, playful expressions of emotion are feminine, and because I was trying very hard to fit my life into a masculine narrative, I avoided them. Now I'm free. I can use them all I want. Some are less straightforwardly connected to the change in narrative per se. I used to take very poor care of myself physically, and in particular I was dismissive of the idea of doing anything to look good. The reason wasn't because I saw those things as unmasculine. It was because I didn't think my narrative had room for not hating how I look. That no matter what I did, I would always hate it, because the root causes of that hatred were unchangeable. But they're not. I can and am changing it. I don't have to hate my body, not in this new narrative. And it turns out that self-care feels good. and playing around with outfits and makeup and hair is fun. I could have done these things before within my old prison of attempted masculinity. Well, maybe not makeup. That is pretty feminine coded still. They would have been fun, but I rejected them even though they would have felt good because they didn't fit. Like most people do most of the time, I chose consistency over happiness. I chose the familiar cage over the open field. Johnny's doing the same, rejecting the memory of going to the moon because it doesn't fit with his sense of self. Rejecting any attempts at change for the better because where he is comfortable. This is a big part of why you can't change a person, as Rosaline and Watts are rapidly learning. Not deliberately and directly, anyway. The saying goes, you can't change someone who doesn't want to change, but that's not entirely accurate. Wanting to change isn't enough. More accurate, but less pithy, would be you can't change someone unless the change fits into their narrative of self. Someone's narrative of self can change, of course. Mine has. But narrative identity is such a complex thing. There are feedback loops, for example, where events that don't fit the narrative are pushed away, and then the fact that only events which do fit remain reinforces the narrative. And there are the ways different aspects of a person's identity reinforce or depend upon one another. My Jewish heritage informs my politics, both inform and are informed by my ethos, and so on. That too makes changing the narrative hard. Everything interlocks with everything else, a huge and complex puzzle in which every part impacts every other part. But again, there's that feedback loop. Events and ideas that just barely fit into the narrative can shift it a little and eventually transform it. That's basically what talk therapy is about. A lot of mental illness can be understood as a kind of narrative too. And the goal of therapy is to build new structures, new patterns of thought and feeling that can eventually be used to challenge the old, constraining ones. And two, that's basically Watts and Rosaline's job, which in this, easily the funniest sequence of the game, they fail spectacularly to do, flailing increasingly wildly as exhaustion and desperation take their toll. Remember, we're on the clock here. Johnny's new memories have to be finished and uploaded before he dies, and that's a matter of hours at most. But it's actually really important to the game, I think, and to the story it's telling, that this sequence is so funny. We're at roughly the midpoint of the game, the second of 3 acts, and Act 3 is going to get into some emotionally heavy, intense stuff. A bit of levity beforehand is important, for a couple of reasons. It helps maintain the game's energy and momentum at a time when, plot-wise, the characters are stymied and churning their wheels. And it helps provide contrast for the relative darkness to come. That kind of contrast is important. It's the reason for the 2 standard 3-act structures, neither of which this game quite uses. One, the more familiar one, ends the first act with the protagonist succeeding, the second with the protagonist suffering a major setback or failure, and the third with the protagonist's final success. Or, to use the most familiar modern example, the first is Star Wars, the second is The Empire Strikes Back, and the third is Return of the Jedi. The other standard 3-act structure is the typical tragedy, and it's the exact opposite. The first act ends with the protagonist suffering a setback, the second with success, and the third with their final defeat. Nearly as common, though neither is remotely as common as the success-failure-success structure, is success-success-failure. The dead giveaway of whether a 3-act work is a tragedy is the second act. If it's happy, the ending of the story will probably be sad, and vice versa. The reason for this, as I said, is contrast. We tend to become numb to any stimulus that goes on too long. A chain of successes with no setbacks is monotonous and boring. And the same goes for misery without break. We feel things more keenly if they're preceded by something very different. To use a different kind of structure, that's why TV series will often position a light, fun, comedic episode right before the finale or other major event, as a sort of breather that also intensifies the impact of what comes next. Greater intensity, in turn, makes the work more memorable and more fun. As I said, the 3 acts of To the Moon do not follow a typical structure. But contrast is still important, both to keep up the player's energy in the face of, let's face it, a story that's been quite sad so far and is about to get sadder, and to create a contrast with the coming darkness. That said, it's not going to jump straight from this nonsense to peak sadness. That can be done and has its own uses, but it is jarring for the player. The game is instead going to ease us out in a sense. After all, as funny as this sequence is, it's still a series of failures for the characters. They're stuck, and of course they have feelings about being stuck. Who wouldn't? Which again brings us back to the idea of maintaining the illusion of control over the story. The humor here works for that as well, because this is a case where the characters are stuck but the player isn't. The player is still advancing in this sequence, still moving on with the game. In fact, at the same moment that the characters suffered their setback, the player got a huge indicator of progress, being told that we're now in Act 2. So the player's feelings aren't the character's feelings. That disconnect could endanger the illusion of control, except that the emotions the story is engendering and expects the player to react with aren't the character's feelings either. The player has been rewarded for their play with the announcement of Act 2, and so they get a funny, rewarding sequence to match that. But as we said, the characters don't feel that, and as rooted in character as the game is, we must eventually return to that. So we get this scene of Rosaline pretty much despairing. While her words are as analytical as ever, her logic doesn't actually make much sense. She talks about the same desire producing 2 different results at 2 different times, but that seems to be the precise opposite of the situation at hand. The issue we've encountered is 2 different desires, Johnny's original narrative and the implanted desire to go to the moon, producing the same result at the same time. Namely, that the present in his mind is unchanged. But the framing makes sense of this. Rosaline is struggling with her failure, plunged into darkness while the frame contracts massively on her sprite, leaving it heavily pixelated. We are seeing her broken down into components, rendered into a cluster of perfect geometry. She is still a character. For all that she is trying to analyze, her analysis makes no sense, and her conclusion that River is to blame pretty much comes out of nowhere. It would be far more reasonable to conclude that the memory they can't reach is the problem. As it turns out, it's a little of both. But that's just it. They can't reach that memory. If that's the answer, then they are stuck. So she has to assume it isn't the answer and take a stab at something else. She's experienced, so her intuition is well trained, and so she gets it right, even if the chain she uses to get there makes no sense. But that means this is Rosaline giving up on reaching beyond that memory and feeling bad about that. The framing, the darkness, the music, the way she's sort of dissolving into pixels, it all suggests that she is feeling this failure. This is her nadir, her midnight in the garden, her moment of despair. It's important to the story that we see that, and important that we see it from Rosaline precisely because there are scenes later that could initially read as her being cold and uncaring. This scene shows that she isn't. She cares intensely. She is deeply upset by the prospect of failure, and that informs her actions later, even though by that point the player's positionality is situated more in Watts, with Rosaline taking an almost antagonistic position. But both her vigil on the cliffside and her conversation with Lily show her humanity. Of course, the player has the option to just skip all this, but it is a deeply humanizing scene for both characters, telling us who Lily is beyond just Johnny's caretaker, and giving us a chance to see Rosaline being sympathetic and compassionate in her questions. Lily's story, meanwhile, is tragic. She makes a point of saying her husband was in the last group of soldiers shipped out for the war in which he died. She has clearly thought about this, that if he'd been a little later, or if the war had ended a little sooner, he would still be around for her and her children. But a bad job market left her in dire straits. As with the whole thing about paying for River's treatment, poverty looms as an ever-present threat in this game. This is clearly a dark future where capitalism still reigns and remains a driver of decisions that ought to be about doing what's best for the people involved. In particular, Lily shouldn't have to fear for the well-being of her children because jobs are hard to come by. But that's the future to expect? Jobs are hard to come by. Jobs that pay enough to live off even harder. And it's just going to get worse. Automation is wiping out career after career, enriching the owners while putting the workers on the street. It is one of the subtler themes of this game, the way in which capitalism, and the threat of the poverty it creates, distorts lives. It drives characters to act out of fear and ties directly into Watts and Rosaline's anxiety about possibly failing at their jobs. Part of that is, as we see with both of them at various points, that they care about their patient and making his last moments happy. But part of it is the lingering fear of losing their jobs, the fear that every worker feels at some point. As the game begins its turn toward greater darkness, fear will matter much more. We've already seen some examples. The fear of losing a loved one, the fear of rejection, the fear of isolation, but those will be mounting as we continue. And of course, we still need to confront the biggest of the fears this game addresses, the fear of not only dying, but dying unfulfilled. In a way, that's really what Lily worried about and what she seeks to save Johnny from by becoming first his housekeeper and then his caretaker. She fears starvation, privation, the harm to herself and her children, that she will risk her own death or theirs. And too, she comes to care about him. She doesn't want Johnny to be alone. She fears his last days will be miserable, that he will die unfulfilled. And now she has to face her fears again. With Johnny dying, where will she live? How will she survive? She's right back where she started. Except, and I bring this up now because I won't have time to talk about it at the end of the game, she isn't. Johnny is going to gift her his house in his will. After all, he can't get anything out of it anymore, and she does. Which is, of course, the problem of capitalism in a nutshell. There's more than enough of everything for everyone to live well, but a tiny number of people have vastly more than they could possibly ever use or derive any benefit from, condemning much, much larger numbers of people to have not enough. And everyone in between has to scramble, serving the first group in hopes of being doled out enough crumbs to not end up in the second. Anyway, Watts brings up beta blockers. Primarily a treatment for heart problems and high blood pressure, they have a prominent off-label use treating anxiety. This is actually fairly common. Government agencies like the FCC test drugs for two things: to make sure they're safe and to make sure they treat a particular condition or set of conditions. So if the FCC approves a drug for specific use, doctors might prescribe it for another based on a side effect that could be helpful. Beta blockers. They have side effects that are useful in treating anxiety, so doctors sometimes prescribe them for that. There's also been, and this seems to be what the game is referencing, some research to suggest they can also be used to prevent PTSD. If you administer a particular beta blocker, propranolol, soon after a potentially traumatic event, it may be able to reduce the likelihood of the patient developing PTSD. That said, from my reading, it really doesn't work how the game is presenting it. It doesn't seem to cause amnesia around and before the event. Rather, it prevents memory formation at the time you take it and reduces the emotional impact of traumatic memories. It wouldn't erase Johnny's memories, just reduce how much they affected him, the exact opposite of what the game depicts. In fact, the game's depiction is a lot more like PTSD than it is like the effects of beta blockers in treating PTSD. Traumatic amnesia is a thing. It's where my own memory problems come from, in large part. Despite the name and popular depictions, flashbacks can be emotional rather than perceptual. That is, trauma flashbacks are about reliving how you felt at the moment you were traumatized, not necessarily reliving the events themselves. That's much closer to what happened to Johnny. The events are gone, but the emotions remain. Not to mention, if the beta blockers had worked, they wouldn't have unlinked the memory. Beta blockers prevent the formation of long-term memories. The memories affected would never have existed because Johnny's brain would have never recorded them. It would be like he blacked out. Even smell wouldn't help. Supposedly, smell is the strongest evoker of memory. I can't say I've ever experienced this, but then my memory is a shambles. I've seen articles on the neurology involved from fairly reputable sources, so I guess it's true. Regardless, if the beta blockers had worked, this wouldn't. There's a simple solution, of course. Johnny was a child when they were administered. He never consented, couldn't consent. It's the great ethical paradox of parenting. Children are people, and you're obligated to get people's consent before you do things to them, but parents can't. Parents have to make decisions for their children that the children are too young to make, even though it's the children that have to live with the consequences. That makes Johnny's situation a parallel to the end of River's life. Someone who loved him tried to make a decision for him, impose a treatment on him, and it didn't work. This all makes sense if the beta blockers failed and Johnny has traumatic amnesia around the memory we weren't able to access. So let's take that reading and move on. Next time on Replay, the show where games are art.